And welcome to our new studio at the European Parliament. It's been a very hectic week here in Brussels as President Obama made his first visit to the EU headquarters since he took office in 2009. Now, there is an old joke American diplomats love to tell. It goes like this: is there such a thing as the European Union? If so, please give us the number, because our president wants to talk to the president of Europe, but he doesn't know where he lives. It says a lot about the way Americans perceive the European Union, of course. Well, this week, President Obama got to meet the presidents of two key EU institutions, the Council and the Commission. Talks focus mainly on Ukraine. With my guests, we'll debrief this very important visit. And there will be more Ukraine in the second part of the program. I'll talk to the man who represents Russia's interests here in Brussels, the Russian ambassador to the EU, Vladimir Chizhov. Ian Lesser, welcome to Talking Europe. You are a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. You're also the executive director of the Transatlantic Center. Also with us on this set, Tarja Cronberg. Hello, you're a Finnish MEP from the group of the Greens. You're a security expert. Your country, Finland, obviously shares a border with Russia.
Over 1,000 kilometers.
And also with us, our partner, Tim King from European Voice. You're the editor of this European magazine that provides independent insight into the Brussels Beltway. Welcome to all of you. Tarja Cronberg, I'll start with you. A couple of months ago, it looked like bilateral talks were dominated by the so-called Snowden scandal. What I saw this week when I was covering Obama's visit was a sense of unity. It looks like the crisis in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea by Russia has acted as a sort of catalyst for reuniting Europeans and Americans. Is it your feeling too?
Well, I think at least this was a return of President Obama to Europe. Whether it's permanent and whether it actually covers the differences of opinion, this is difficult to say. It's at least symbolic, and I think there's unity in terms of actually Europe and US have to deal with Russia together. On the other hand, I think it covers up under many difficulties. This is about defining the borders of Europe, and it may not be so important for the US, while it is very, very important for the European Union.
Tim King, President Obama made a very important speech this week here in Brussels. He called on Europeans to defend what he calls their values, liberty. There was a lot of pressure on the Europeans to be firm vis-à-vis Russia, the Kremlin. Do you think that President Obama is happy with what he got from his European partners this week?
I think he will think that depends on what happens next over the coming weeks, which partly depends on how Vladimir Putin behaves. But actually, my cynical journalist hat on, I think that he might have been in some ways grateful to Mr. Putin for setting him up with a situation where he talks about shared values, respect for freedom and so on. That's in some ways easier to talk about between the EU and the US than rather more difficult issues of their respective positions in the economic landscape as it now is, with talk about whether the US has been shifting towards Asia and so on. So I think I'm being perhaps too cynical, but maybe it's easier to talk about liberty and democracy and things like that than to talk about the nitty-gritty stuff.
Ian Lesser, what is the perception in Washington? Europe often appears as a divided bloc. On Ukraine, what is the perception? Is there a feeling that the Europeans are ready to follow Washington in keeping up the pressure on Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think there are a couple of things to say. I mean, one is that there was a bit of mythology about the United States actually having a debate about the desire for a cohesive, activist Europe. In fact, that debate is long over in Washington, and now we have a crisis that sort of crystallizes it. I think he comes here with really a mainstream American idea that more Europe, a more cohesive Europe, a stronger European voice, and more burden sharing, of course, because that means money too, which isn't always so easy. But anyway, those those things are a good thing for American interests. I think that's very, very clear. The other piece of it, of course, is I think a lot of what he said in the speech on Ukraine will actually sound familiar to European ears, because he didn't actually push a very aggressive line about the military security aspect of all of this. It was much more political in tone.
And there was a clear message to the Europeans: don't believe that peace is granted forever. You will have to fight for it. As you said, no military intervention in Ukraine, but be ready to impose a cost on Russia if need be. In Finland, it's a very sensitive issue, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think it's important for all Europeans to understand that what we think about peace, that European Union is a peace project and it's forever and there are no challenges. I think this has proven wrong now, that there are challenges and that we have to be serious. On the question of Finland, of course, it is a very sensitive issue in the sense that we are a member of the European Union, but also have very good relations with Russia and want to keep it that way. So in this way, we are one of the border countries that, first of all, if broad economic sanctions will be actually implemented.
Which would be the next step.
Exactly. If it's not only a threat, but also something very concrete, this will affect many Finnish companies, it will affect the Finnish economy, and probably also the European economy as a whole. So it's very important that before we implement these sanctions to actually look at the consequences. I think Finland and other countries have a push for this.
This is very telling, Tim King, I guess. This says a lot about the internal divisions in the European Union.
Yes, I mean, we at European Voice sort of love testing out the degree to which there is unity, the divisions between the member states and so on. So this is kind of grist to my mill, really. There are pages and pages that we can get out of this. And the issue of the tensions between member states, the extent to which those countries directly bordering Ukraine or directly bordering Russia will suffer more than those bordering the Mediterranean is one aspect.
But then what's interesting is that even the Mediterranean countries are not really keen on sanctions. The hardest voices, the toughest voices come from Eastern Europe.
And the energy security issues, right. We learnt painfully during earlier occasions when the supply of gas through Ukraine was cut off, that the likes of Italy were affected by that as well. So, I mean, there are issues where one could expect European Union member states to come together in recognising, say, the importance of energy security and diversifying energy supply. But then they'll find other reasons to disagree.
You said no military intervention in Ukraine. However, though, President Obama has another weapon, gas, liquefied gas, and he hinted very clearly this week that he would be ready to export gas to Europe. Could this be a game changer?
Well, I wouldn't call it a game changer. There's a big debate about this in the United States, too. In fact, these kinds of additional LNG exports were coming. How much of an effect it would have on Europe's current energy exposure to Russia, it's hard to say, but most experts seem to feel not much,
right.
At least in the near term. It's going to take a while, it could take years, it's very expensive, this gas won't be as cheap as many people assume, etc. So there are a lot of things like that, including the development of gas resources in the Eastern Mediterranean, where the United States also has a role. These things could be accelerated. They're good things to do because they sort of show Russia that the energy security equation isn't necessarily on their side for that. But they're not going to have prompt effects. You know, I think on the military side of it, what struck me very clearly about the speech, I was listening to it, was that the sort of solidity of this NATO guarantee, which is obvious, but it was restated very, very, very forcefully. That drawing that line, if there's a red line, if we can use that term here, it's really about the NATO security guarantee for current NATO members.
Don't try meddling in Lithuania, Poland. That
precisely.
was the message. Now, we talked a lot about Ukraine. Now, talks also focused on a possible free trade agreement between Washington and Brussels, known as the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This deal would encompass half the world's economy, bringing together 800 million consumers. Let's watch our report.
Leaders on both sides of the Atlantic believe it is possible to reach an agreement on what would be the biggest bilateral free trade deal in history. A free market encompassing 800 million people from the EU and US. It's a move aimed to energise massive growth and create jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. The EU claims the proposed Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, could boost the size of its economy by 120 billion euros, or 0.5% of GDP. The US economy would also see a bump of 95 billion euros, or 0.4% of GDP. But there are plenty of critics. Several European NGOs have expressed concerns that a deal could tie governments' hands in the face of powerful US corporations. In January, 30,000 protesters rallied on behalf of German farmers in Berlin. Many fear the TTIP could impact the agricultural sector.
We're afraid of the free trade agreement between the US and the European Union. We're afraid that chlorine chicken, hormone-treated meats and genetic engineering ends up on our plates, and we're against that.
Negotiators are hoping to reach a deal by the end of 2014. Even if an agreement is brokered, it would then pass to the EU Parliament, where several MEPs have already voiced their objections.
Tim, talks on a free trade agreement between Washington and Brussels started in June last year. Now, the European Commission says this would be the cheapest stimulus package in history. They believe it could bring an additional 100 billion euros in revenues each year. But it's a very divisive issue. It's a very polarizing issue here in Brussels, isn't it?
It is, and not just here in Brussels. And looking at that film clip, for old lags like me who've been around this city for too long, some of those agricultural issues about chlorine chicken and hormone beef and all these, we've met them all before. And the interesting thing is how quickly you can mobilise those established lobby groups again at the idea of these particular negotiations. There's a feeling really that things aren't going as fast as people had hoped back in June.
Did President Obama's visit help unlock some of these problems?
I'm not sure it did. I mean, I think he came up with personal assurances. Look, I'll look after the environmental aspects. I'll look after the social issues. This is what I, as a good Democrat, am concerned about. But I'm not sure that there was so much of substance.
Ian Lesser, we hear a lot about the criticism here in Europe, but what about the Americans? How keen are they to seal this free trade deal?
Well, we have
Europe?
a similar debate. The issues are slightly different, but we have our own sensitivities on agriculture and on other questions like this. Looming in the background, of course, there is this idea that somehow to restore Atlantic competitiveness with Asian competitors on the rise, China above all, provides a logic for both sides of this. But that's essentially a political strategic argument in part. And I think part of what the administration was trying to do in the visit was to restore the momentum behind the negotiations, but that political strategic argument, which at the end of the day is going to be critical in parliaments and in Congress. And in an odd way, the Ukraine crisis, refocusing on the Atlantic, in a strange way, reinforces that logic.
Interesting that President Obama said that if Europe signs this free trade deal, it will make it easier for the United States to export liquefied gas. So you see, it's all, getting together.
Exactly. I mean, and that's the natural instinct of the administration, of the president, is to try to cast the argument at that strategic level rather than to be in the nitty-gritty of the negotiations, where there is, I think, a risk that the administration, having committed itself, will wind up with something minimal in the end rather than something sweeping.
Do you believe the argument of the European Commission that says that this would bring 100 billion euros in additional revenues each year?
I think one of the things is that the cultures are very different between the US and Europe. If we take the single market, it has been a problem to establish it. And to make a single market between the US and Europe is even more difficult. We can see it in questions of social protection standards, environmental standards. We see it in the structures of companies. Over 90% of the European companies are very small and medium-sized businesses as compared to the huge US companies. So I think there are some unbalances which have to be cleared out, and there must be some exceptions for public services. I have a very difficult time thinking that American companies would take care of Finnish prisons, for example.
Now, to finish the program and sum it up, what lessons do you draw from President Obama's first visit to the EU headquarters?
Well, I think US-EU summits are summits like no other, in the sense that you don't really need them to make the transatlantic relationship work. There's so much that goes on every day, every week, every month, on all of these fronts, whether it's security or economy and other things. You don't really need them for that purpose. You need them as a kind of reassertion of values, as the president referred to it, but also it's just high symbolism in theater. And, you know, sitting there in that speech yesterday, you really sort of feel
what
that.
about the fallout from the Snowden scandal?
Well, you know, this is interesting because beforehand everyone thought that that would really be prominent on the agenda. And to be sure, there is this question of trust.
But it was hardly mentioned.
It was hardly mentioned.
That was a big surprise.
But I think, you know, as
honest.
part of the strategy to fix that, it's getting some of these other things that we've been talking about right. I mean, there are issues of trust on all of these policy questions. And the truth is that publics, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic, we've actually done polling to show this, don't have very different views about these questions of privacy.
Okay. Well, Tim King, what is your leading story this week in European Voice?
Well,
I guess.
It's Mr. Obama's visit,
Okay.
and specifically his demands about energy policy, because that's where I think there might be some the EU might respond with some changes.
And then looking back at the week in Europe, it was a good week.
It was a good week for Marine Le Pen in the French municipal elections, the first round of those, and that may have its momentum effect on the European Parliament here. And it was a bad week for Geert Wilders because his intemperate remarks meant that various people left his party.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for taking part in this edition of Talking Europe. And please stay with me. I'll return just after the news break. As I told you earlier, we'll continue to talk about Ukraine. I will meet the Russian ambassador to the European Union, Vladimir Chizhov.